Welcome back, everyone, to the Deep Dive. This time, we're going deep on filters and middleware in .NET Core,
Oh, yeah.
which
Yeah.
I gotta say can be kind of tricky to wrap your head around sometimes.
Absolutely. A lot of folks get tripped up by these two.
So, for our listeners who maybe haven't had to wrestle with this yet, what's the core problem we're solving here?
So .NET Core itself, right, it's this super versatile framework. You can build all sorts of apps with it.
Right, web apps, desktop apps, the whole shebang.
Exactly. But where it really shines is in modern web applications, especially on the server side.
Mm-hmm.
And as you build out these complex web apps, you're going to run into these tasks, these things that need to happen like across the board.
Yeah,
It doesn't matter what specific feature you're working on, they always come up.
I'm with you.
Things like, say you want to log every single request that hits your server.
Makes sense. Got to keep track of what's going on.
Right. Or imagine you need to verify that a user is logged in before they access certain data.
Security, super important.
You got it.
Yeah, these are things you wouldn't want to write the same code for over and over again, right?
Exactly. Be a nightmare to maintain.
Total mess.
And that's precisely where filters and middleware step in. They're like these elegant tools for handling what we call cross-cutting concerns.
Okay, so both of them help us avoid writing the same code a zillion times,
You got it.
but they go about it in different ways.
Yeah. Let's picture this. Think about an HTTP request. It's coming in from a user's browser, heading towards your .NET Core app.
Gotcha.
It travels through this thing called a pipeline.
Like a factory conveyor belt.
Yeah, perfect analogy. And at different points along that belt, different components can act on that request.
Interesting.
They can inspect it, they can modify it, you name it. And middleware, that's middleware's domain. It's like a stage in that pipeline. It can jump in at any point.
So middleware is like pretty broad in scope.
Very broad. It doesn't care what your request is trying to do. It can step in regardless.
Can you give us a real-world example, something to help visualize that?
Okay, imagine you've got this middleware component,
Okay.
and its job is to log some basic info about every single request.
Right.
Like, what's the HTTP method? What's the path being requested? Stuff like that.
Gotcha.
So every time a request comes through, this middleware would kick in.
Log that information?
Yep, and then pass it along to the next stage in the pipeline like nothing happened.
So it's like always watching, always taking notes.
Exactly.
Oh.
Now, filters, they're a little different. They live in the world of MVC.
MVC, that's the model view controller pattern, right?
Eh.
Just for our listener who might not be familiar.
You got it. It's a way to organize our code in web applications. Think of it like this.
Okay.
You've got the model, that's like the data, the raw ingredients.
Okay.
Then you've got the view, that's how you present that data, like the plating, the presentation of a dish.
Gotcha.
And then there's the controller. The controller is the chef, orchestrating everything, taking requests and figuring out what to do.
Makes sense.
And filters, they're like special instructions for that chef.
Oh.
They say things like, hey, only take this order if it meets these criteria. Or, after you prepare this dish, always add this garnish.
So they're more specific, more targeted than middleware.
Exactly. Filters let you fine-tune how specific actions within your MVC framework behave.
Okay, so I'm seeing the difference. Middleware is like a citywide rule. Filters are more like building codes.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. But here's where it gets interesting.
Okay.
You can actually apply filters globally.
Really?
Yeah, like saying, hey, all chefs in the city, always wash your hands before cooking.
No.
But just because you can do that doesn't mean you always should.
Ah, so there's a catch.
Or often is.
So why wouldn't we just use global filters all the time? If they can do what middleware does, why bother?
That's a smart question.
Thanks.
And it gets to the heart of why understanding these nuances is so important.
Okay. I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
Even though you can make filters act globally, they're fundamentally designed for that MVC world. They're meant to work with models, views, controllers. And if your logic doesn't actually need those things, you're adding unnecessary complexity.
It's like if you're just trying to log a request, you don't need to involve the entire restaurant kitchen, right?
Exactly. Middleware, on the other hand, it's built for that broader scope. It can operate across your entire application, whether it's MVC or not.
Okay, so middleware is more like a general contractor. Filters are specialized electricians or plumbers.
Yeah, that's a good way to think about it.
So I'm starting to get it. Middleware is big picture. Filters are more focused.
You got it.
But how do I know when to use which? Like, in real-world coding, when would I reach for one over the other?
That's the million-dollar question. And honestly, there's no single right answer.
Figures.
But let's dive into some concrete scenarios. I think that'll help clear things up.
Okay, sounds good.
Let's start with authentication. That's a classic use case. So authentication, right. It's all about making sure the right people are accessing the right stuff.
Yeah, crucial in pretty much any web app these days.
For sure. And a lot of times, middleware is your go-to tool for that.
Oh, why is that?
Well, think about it. Authentication often needs to happen like across the board.
Right.
It doesn't matter what specific page or action the user is trying to do.
Got to check their ID at the door, so to speak.
Exactly. And middleware, it's perfect for that. It can step in early in that pipeline, check if the user's logged in, and if not...
Boom, redirect them to the login page.
Exactly. Or you could return some kind of error, whatever makes sense for your app.
Okay, I could see how middleware would be handy there. Can we, look at some code to make this more concrete?
Sure. Let's say we've got this app, right? And there's a section, an admin section,
Okay.
where only logged in admins should be able to mess around.
Makes sense.
We could write some middleware specifically to guard that admin section.
All right, what would that look like?
Something like this, maybe. C# public class authentication middleware, private read-only, request delegate next. Public authentication middleware, request delegate next. Public async task invoke async, HTTP context if context.request.path starts with segments admin and dot context dot user dot identity dot isauthenticated context dot response dot redirect login dot return next context. So this middleware, it's looking at every request that comes in.
Okay.
And it checks first off, is this request going to that admin section?
If it is.
Then it checks, is the user authenticated, meaning have they logged in successfully?
Gotcha. And if they haven't?
Redirects them straight to login page. No messing around.
Nice. So that admin section is locked down tight.
Yeah. And this is just one example, right? You can get super creative with how you use middleware for authentication.
I bet. But what about filters? When would we use those?
Filters are really powerful when you need that finer-grained control, like within your MVC actions.
Okay.
Imagine you've got this action, and it handles updating a user's profile.
Mm-hmm.
You might want to make sure before you even touch the database that the data they're sending is valid.
Right. Make sure they haven't left fields blank or typed in gibberish.
Exactly. That's a perfect job for a filter.
How so?
Well, a filter can sit right there in front of that action method.
Okay.
And it can inspect the incoming data, make sure everything's kosher.
If it's not.
You could return an error to the user, maybe highlight the problematic fields.
So the action itself doesn't even have to worry about that validation stuff.
Nope. The filter handles it all. Keeps your action code nice and clean.
That's clever.
Yeah.
Can we see a code snippet for that just to make it super clear?
Of course. Let's say your user profile has a first name and last name, right?
Yeah, pretty standard.
You could write a filter like this. C#, public class, user profile validation filter, action filter attribute. Public class, user profile validation filter, public class, user profile validation filter. Public override void on action executing context. Public class, user profile validation filter, and public class, user profile validation filter. Var user profile includes context. Action arguments, user profile is user profile model. Public class, user profile validation filter, after sip, user profile validation filter, if user profile validation filter, os2c profile context, result. Exalt, new bad request object result, invalid user profile data, public class, user profile validation filter, dot return, public class, user profile validation filter, public class, user profile validation filter, if string dot is null or empty, user profile dot first name, user profile dot first name, something like 50, public class, user profile validation filter, public class, user profile validation filter, public class, user profile validation filter, dot context dot model state dot add modeler, first name is required and must be less than 50 characters. Public class, user profile validation filter, top class, if string dot is null or empty, user profile dot last name, user profile dot length 50. Public class, user profile validation filter, public class, user profile validation filter, context dot model state dot add modeler. Last name is required and must be less than 50 characters. Public class, user profile validation filter, public class, user profile validation filter, if. Public class, user profile validation filter validation, if dot context dot model state. Public class, user profile validation filter, public class, user profile validation filter, validates new bad request object result, context.model state, public class, user profile validation filter, public class, user profile validation filter, full policy, public class, user profile validation filter. This filter, it grabs the user profile data from the incoming request.
Okay.
And then it checks those first name and last name
If
fields.
they're empty or too long.
It adds an error to the model state.
And that prevents the action from even running, right?
You got it. The action only gets called if that data passes the filter's checks.
Okay, so filters are really good at that, like guarding specific actions.
Yeah, they're like specialized bouncers, making sure everything's in order before letting the action do its thing.
Cool. But what if the lines get blurry? Like what if it's not super obvious whether to use middleware or a filter?
That definitely happens. Caching, for instance. That can be a tough one.
Caching, like storing data so you don't have to recalculate it every time.
Exactly. And at first glance, you might think, oh, middleware. It's global. It can handle caching for the whole app.
Yeah, that makes sense.
But then you realize, wait a minute. Maybe I only want to cache certain things.
Oh, like maybe some data changes frequently, other stuff is more static
Exactly. And suddenly, filters start looking more appealing.
because they're more targeted.
Exactly. You can slap a caching filter on just the actions that need it.
Okay, so it's not always a clear-cut choice.
Nope. Sometimes you gotta weigh the pros and cons.
And sometimes you might even use both.
Absolutely. You could have middleware handling some general caching, and then filters fine-tuning it for specific cases.
So it's all about being flexible, using the right tool for the job.
Exactly. Now, we've talked a lot about what these tools do, how they work,
Yeah.
but there's another important aspect to consider, and that's performance.
Oh, right, how fast our code runs.
Yeah, and it turns out the choice between middleware and filters can actually impact that.
Really?
Yeah. Generally speaking, middleware has the potential to be a bit faster.
Interesting. Why is that?
Well, think about where middleware sits. It's right there at the start of the pipeline,
Okay.
before even the MVC framework gets involved.
Gotcha.
So if middleware can handle a request right then and there, boom, it's done. No need to go through all the MVC machinery.
It's like, if you can solve a problem at the front desk, you don't need to call in the whole team.
Exactly. Saves time and resources.
But doesn't middleware, like, run on every request? Even the ones where it doesn't need to do anything?
Good point. And yeah, that can add a tiny bit of overhead.
So there's a trade-off.
There always is, right?
Yeah.
But well-written middleware, it should be super lightweight, even when it's not actively doing anything.
Okay, so it's not like it's going to slow your app to a crawl.
Nope. Plus, you can configure middleware to only run under certain conditions.
Oh, like only if the request is for a specific path or uses a certain HTTP method.
You got it. So you can fine-tune when that middleware kicks in, minimize any unnecessary work.
Smart. So if we're really concerned about performance, middleware is worth considering.
Yeah, especially for tasks like basic authentication or logging, things that can be done early on.
But you said well-written middleware. What makes middleware performant? Any tips?
Keep it lean and mean. Only do what absolutely needs to be done.
Okay.
Avoid complex logic, long-running operations, all that jazz.
Right, because that's going to bog things down.
Exactly. Think of it like a pit stop in a race. You want to get in, do what you need to do, and get out as fast as possible.
Love that analogy.
And remember, don't prematurely optimize. Focus on writing clean, understandable code first.
Right. Get it working, then worry about squeezing out every last millisecond.
You got it. Now, we've talked functionality, performance.
Yeah, it's been a lot.
But there's another piece of the puzzle, and that's code organization. How do filters and middleware affect the structure of our code base? How easy is it to maintain, to read, all that good stuff?
Ooh, that's important. Nobody wants to work with spaghetti code.
Exactly. And that's where things get really interesting. So yeah, code organization, it's like the unsung hero of software development.
It really is, though.
Yeah.
I mean, you can have the most efficient algorithm in the world,
Right.
but if nobody can understand it, good luck making changes 6 months down the line.
Exactly. And when it comes to filters versus middleware,
Mm-hmm.
this is where I think some of the biggest differences really come into play.
Okay, I'm all ears. So middleware, how's that for code organization?
Middleware, inherently, it kind of nudges you towards this nice modular structure.
Oh, wait.
Each middleware component, it's like its own self-contained unit.
Gotcha.
It does its one specific thing, and that's it.
Right. Single responsibility principle.
You got it. And the beauty of that is
What's that?
you can add new middleware components, you can remove them, you can rearrange them,
Okay.
and it doesn't really mess with the rest of the pipeline.
Like Lego blocks, kind of?
Yeah, that's a perfect analogy. You can snap things together, pull them apart, super flexible.
And easier to maintain, I imagine.
Way easier, because if something breaks, you know exactly where to look.
Makes sense. What about code reuse?
Oh, middleware's fantastic for that.
Really?
Yeah, because you can take that middleware component, that little Lego block, and you can use it in a completely different part of your application, or even a
Mhm.
totally different project.
Okay, so middleware is looking pretty good on the organization front.
It really is.
What about filters? Do they get like a messy reputation?
Filters can be great, don't get me wrong,
Yeah.
but they can also lead to some, shall we say, less organized code,
Oh no.
especially if you're not careful with how you use them.
How so?
Well, filters, they tend to live inside your controller actions.
Ted.
So you've got this action method, and then bam, a filter right in the middle of it,
Right.
and then another one, and suddenly it's like this dense forest of filters.
Hard to see the trees for the filters in this case.
Exactly. It can get really hard to follow the flow of the request.
Like, where does this logic start? Where does it end? Who's responsible for what?
You got it. It's like instead of that nice, neat toolbox,
Yeah.
you've got this one giant drawer, and everything's just crammed in there.
Ah, the dreaded junk drawer.
Exactly.
Okay, so filters, maybe not always the best for keeping things tidy.
It depends. Used sparingly, they can be fine, but it's easy to go overboard.
And then you end up with that junk drawer situation.
Yeah. So, some advice. If you're using a bunch of filters, think about grouping them together.
Okay.
Maybe create a separate class just for your filters or even some custom attributes.
To encapsulate that logic.
You got it. Makes it way easier to understand and maintain.
Right, because if you're constantly digging through that junk drawer,
Yeah,
you're going to waste a lot of time and probably get frustrated.
for sure. And remember, good code organization, it's not just about making things pretty.
It's not.
It's about making your application more robust, more scalable in the long run.
Because if it's easy to understand,
Exactly.
it's easier to make changes, add new features, fix bugs, all that.
You got it.
Okay, so, wow, we've covered a lot today. Filters, middleware, conceptual differences, use cases, performance, even code organization.
It's been a journey.
It really has. Any final thoughts before we let our listeners go? Anything they should keep in mind as they start using these tools?
Just remember, there's no silver bullet.
No one-size-fits-all solution.
Exactly. The best tool for the job, it's going to depend on your specific situation, your needs. So take the time to really understand how filters and middleware work, what their strengths and weaknesses are, and don't be afraid to experiment. Try things out, see what works for you.
Yeah, because that's how we learn, right?
Exactly. The more you play around with these tools, the better your intuition will become.
Love it. Well, on that note, big thanks to you for guiding us through this deep dive.
My pleasure.
And to all our listeners, keep learning, keep coding, and we'll catch you next time on The Deep Dive. Happy coding, everyone.